Well, there we have the ruling of the International Court of Justice. Just to sort of summate it from what I heard, essentially, Israel being immediately ordered to halt its military offensive, which could bring about the physical destruction of Palestinians in the Rafah area, to open the Rafah crossing to humanitarian aid, to open up for international investigators, in other words, to allow the United Nations to investigate this, and then also, within a month, to submit to the International Court of Justice a report indicating how it has implemented the measures. As South Africa, as the party which brought this case, they would then pass that report on to the South African government for their comments. You with Newsfeed, Newzroom Afrika, Channel 405. I'm Stephen Grootes. With us this afternoon, Jeenah, who is from the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Naeem, good afternoon to you. At first blush, to face value, this appears to be quite a significant victory for South Africa, but more importantly, the Palestinians.
It certainly seems like it. I mean, without having had time to look at it more carefully, it seems to me that the court has ordered provisional measures even a little beyond what South Africa asked for, with one tiny exception. South Africa wanted a report within a week, and they've said within a month. But otherwise, the unequivocal calling for the halting of military operations, I think, is very important, and the unimpeded access for investigators. Which is sorely required, very important, I think, and of course the humanitarian thing would now, as South Africa pointed out in its application, with Israel having taken control of the two crossings from Egypt, it's in complete control of any access to Gaza and has prevented aid from going in.
We're going to have to go through the significance of each of these. First, Israel's now in a position where they've said, their Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who may soon have an arrest warrant out from the International Criminal Court, a separate court to this one, he has said that they would not comply with the International Court of Justice. Now it's clearer, I suppose, than it ever has been from this court that Israel must stop its military offensive in Rafah. The United States has said they should not go into Rafah. They've obviously gone against that. But it is now surely, clearer than it's ever been that in terms of the majority of the world, they're against Israel on this.
Yeah, I mean, for many of us, it's been clear for a while, yes. but the court now, and you get a sense of the court's kind of, let's say, frustration, even in the measured tones in which they were read out, that we told you in January, we told you in March, you're not listening to us, and now we have to say even more than what we already did. So certainly it's clear, but the Israelis are also quite clear that they refuse to accept any instructions from any court or United Nations or any multilateral organization.
So, I mean, Israel, as you know, is very complicated politics at the moment. You've got the most right-wing government that we've ever had in that country. And yet there's also opposition to an extent to the military operation within Israel itself. I would imagine this may strengthen their hand and weaken Netanyahu's, but in domestic politics, perhaps only slightly in Israel.
Yes and no. I mean, the opposition is not so much about ending the operation in Gaza. There's a very tiny tiny part of the population that's calling for that. The bigger opposition is because they feel that Netanyahu, after 7 months, hasn't succeeded in bringing the captives back. And so that's what they want. So you have a military operation for 7 months and you haven't succeeded. What are you up to? Continue with your operation if you will succeed. So that's the issue, really, not so much about Palestinians or about the operation.
The significance of opening the Rafah crossing to humanitarian aid, and the very sort of curious things that are happening. On the one side, we've had the Americans providing weapons to Israel. There's a sort of small sanction imposed, but generally providing weapons to Israel. At the other side, spending a huge amount of money on building a pier that would bring aid to Palestine and to Palestinians. I don't know how much aid has actually been flowing through that pier. But how important is it for the Rafah crossing to be open fully for humanitarian aid? And Israel has placed restrictions there. They deny that. So the court has basically refused to accept their denial. That must be significant in itself.
That's significant. I mean, if you look at the ruling that was given now, it's virtually completely just adopting the South African narrative, with very little or no attention paid to the Israeli kind of response to that. But yes, on the Rafah issue, I mean, as we said, Israel controls those crossings now. But even before that, Israel was, in a sense, not fully in control, but majorly in control, because they determined which trucks could go in, at what pace, etc. And the number of trucks going in was way below what was required even before October last year, in terms of aid because of the siege, etc. The creation of the pier, it's a bit of an odd kind of intervention, because when you look at it, and it's not bringing in aid as they claim it could, but even if it did optimally, it would bring in as much aid as, I think, 15, 20 trucks, which is ridiculous. The whole creation of a pier, for what purpose? And that's why many Palestinians are very suspicious about the pier idea, because the belief is that there's an attempt to kind of cut Gaza off from the rest of Palestine and link it to Cyprus or some other state via that pier.
It's one thing for an Israeli politician to stand up in front of their constituency and say, we are going to ignore the court because we need to continue with our military offensive because we need to protect Israelis. Essentially, they'll be saying to their voters, we're doing this to protect you. Could it be slightly harder for that same person to say we're going to defy the International Criminal Court on the issue of humanitarian aid? It's a very clear order. I mean, what basis could there ever be to basically stop humanitarian aid and essentially force starvation? And I mean, and isn't this sort of underscoring all of this is the claim that our government made, which is that starvation is being used as a war weapon here? It's a very serious claim to make. It's surely harder for, I would like to hope, for an Israeli politician to stand up to their constituency and say, no, we're going to continue doing that.
I don't know, Stephen. It doesn't seem to have been hard in the past few months. I mean, you've had in public, not just to the constituency within Israel, but in public outside of Israel, spokespersons accusing the Secretary General of the UN of being a terrorist or enabling terrorism. In the Security Council, accusing the Security Council of that. In the General Assembly, the Israeli ambassador ripping up the UN Charter, and then making statements in media conferences, Netanyahu and others, that they will not accept whatever the court decides. So it doesn't seem to be hard at all for Israel to say to the world, we don't give a damn about what you or multilateral institutions have to say. We'll do whatever we want.
The situation around the international investigation, and this is very interesting because South Africa brought a series of arguments which, as you say, have been largely accepted by the court, it seems to say. We brought evidence, video footage, all of the rest. We showed it here as it was happening. Israel's argument, to sort of sum it up, really, was that we dispute the evidence. What the court now seems to be saying is that because they say that Gaza must be opened up for any international investigation from the United Nations, they're now, I suppose, maybe calling Israel's bluff on their claim to dispute the evidence. They're saying we want to see for ourselves. I mean, this is quite an important moment. You won't be able to blame Al Jazeera for a United Nations investigation.
Yeah. Yes, but it's also, I think, an expression of that frustration, because up to now, Israel has refused any kind of UN or independent investigation or inquiry whatsoever. So even in January, you remember the court, said there was a plausible case that there was genocide, but it would need to investigate it. Israel said, no, there's no such thing, and we're not allowing any investigation, basically. We're not allowing anyone to go in, no UN, no ICJ or anyone else. And so it's also that kind of a thing, that from the 7th of October up to now, what has happened, it's a battle of narratives. And even saying that is a bit of a problem, because the only real narrative we're getting is the Israeli one in the main. I mean, yes, Al Jazeera, etc. in Gaza, but the kind of bigger narrative is the Israeli one. And so the court is making this point that the truth can only be obtained by an independent investigation, and it's your legal obligation to allow that to take place. So it is an expression of frustration as well.
I was struck by the quotation by the president of this court from a United Nations official, I forget their name, of where Palestinians were being evacuated to, 14 square kilometers of essentially sort of sandy wasteland with very few buildings. Essentially, what the court is saying is we accept that evidence. This is what Israel is doing.
Yes. So Israel's argument, a big part of its argument from January already, was that they're fulfilling their humanitarian obligations by informing people to evacuate. It's a big part of their argument. The court is now saying that's rubbish, because I think it was the head of OCHA who made that statement about the sandy place, agricultural land, so it's not fit for human habitation, and 14 square kilometers for 800,000 people. With no sanitation, no water, etc. So Israel has been pointing to Al-Mawasi, this area, as being, this is the place where we're going to evacuate people to, and so, you know, we're doing what is necessary. And the court is saying that's not true. This cannot hold that number of people, it's not fit for it, and so you're not doing anything, basically.
There's a lot that's going to happen now, but we need to also just look at how the balance of power in the court was. So each of the rulings was 13 votes to 2. The way I understand the court is that the countries essentially take it in turns. To belong to the International Court of Justice, you actually sign up. So South Africa signed up, Israel signed up. That's why we're all parties to it. We can't immediately withdraw either, so Israel can't immediately just withdraw. But as I understand the practice, countries basically take it in turns to have judges. We actually have a Judge Shearat Kladi, a professor when he's at home, on the court. If a country does not have a judge on the court, you actually appoint, the legal phrase is en banc, you appoint a judge on the court so that both countries that are arguing have judges on the court. Judge Barak was the Israeli representative. He was one judge who voted against all of these measures. There was one other judge, the vice president of the court. Otherwise, it was 13-2 in favor of all of these measures. What does that tell us?
Yeah, I mean, if you consider that one of the 2 votes against was an Israeli judge, almost unanimous on every single one, which is a very strong message that the court is sending. And by the way, the ICJ states don't sign up to, by virtue of them being member states of the UN.
Right.
They are signed up in a sense. So the only way to withdraw from the ICJ is to withdraw from the United Nations. But yeah, so the ICJ, in a sense, representing the global community, almost unanimous in taking this position, sends a very strong message, certainly.
You talk about, and you clarify, thank you, the membership of the International Court of Justice. You mentioned a moment, you know, the Israeli ambassador tearing up the UN Charter. I do wonder, with everything that's happening, if we may get to a moment where, and I don't know if it's ever happened before, if Israel might consider withdrawing from the United Nations. I mean, I presume it would lose out in some way if it did that.
I think it'll lose out big time. It's much more useful for Israel to stay in and tear up the charter than to withdraw and then not have that kind of protection, in a sense. Once it's no longer a member state, then it loses a range of privileges that it has while it is. Political and diplomatic privileges and influence and power in the UN. So I think, no, it's not going to withdraw. It'll only leave if it's forcefully kicked out, and it doesn't seem like that's going to happen.
So from here, we're likely to get a strong reaction on both sides. I think there'll be some people on the Palestinian side who will be very pleased with the order, even though we kind of know nothing's going to change on the ground. And that's really the sadness of this.
Yes, I mean, this is the issue, the kind of bittersweet thing from January, that for Palestinians and South Africans, that you get an order of the court that not reiterates but emphasizes everything that you say. But on the ground, it makes no difference. The genocide continues. Rafah will likely still be invaded because the Israelis say that they will. And so it's that bittersweet thing. It's a huge moral victory and political victory, but it doesn't save lives. And it seems that at this point, there's nothing that the international community can do that's going to save lives, short of actually taking strong action in the United Nations Security Council. And that seems unlikely because of the United States.
So, I mean, in the short term, you're of course entirely correct. The long-term game is that we've seen We saw this week with 3 European countries saying that they would recognize Palestine, something that hadn't happened before. What essentially is, there's this very slow process of Israel, it seems to me, becoming more and more like a pariah state. It's a very slow process, but as we've seen in our own history, it's a very important process, even though many Palestinians' lives are going to be lost in the meantime.
Yes, I mean, I think that's, if anything, that's what the past 7 months have done. It sped up that process of Israel becoming a pariah, and frankly, Israel doesn't help its own case in giving itself that kind of pariah status. Many European states are at the very least irritated. I mean, Germany, which has been solidly behind Israel, has now said that they will abide by any warrant of arrest handed down by the International Criminal Court. So if the International Criminal Court issues a warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu, he will not be able to visit Germany, he'll get arrested. Which is, it's huge, because Germany has so solidly been behind Israel. But it seems to be a general kind of feeling among most European states that Israel has gone way beyond anything that is acceptable, and so it's slowly chipping away, perhaps a little faster than just slowly, chipping away at Israel's kind of credibility, even in the West. The United States will be the last bastion, I think, but what we're seeing taking place there, on university campuses, etc., I think that changes are going to take place there too.
Jeenah, thank you very much indeed for coming in from the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection.